Yeah, no, yeah, she told me, yeah. That's too bad.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located here in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And in addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are so very thrilled to have you here, both physically and virtually, on an event here to celebrate Moon of the Turning Leaves, the latest book from Waubgeshig Rice. We're so thrilled that Random House of Canada published this book, and of course that they made this evening possible. We're also delighted to be partnering with our good friends at the Winnipeg International Writers Festival to are co-presenting this event. And you'll be hearing a little bit more from Festival Director Charlene Deal later on. Now, I will, in case you were worried, I know a lot of you are asking why am I talking into a microphone when Rosanna Deerchild is here, so rest assured that she will be up to host in just a little while, and you'll only have to put up with me for a few minutes. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. So there'll be a reading from this podium, and then there'll be a conversation over to my left. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. If you do have a question, just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with this microphone, which is not because we don't believe you can project your voice. It just ensures that those watching on YouTube can hear the question and prevents us from having to repeat it. Now, Charlene from the Writers Festival will be back at the end of the event just to go over some signing notes. But the only thing I'll put in your brain right now is that at the close of the event, we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Waubgeshig Rice to the signing table. And then you can come over and get all your books signed. Now, if you've encountered his work before, you know that this is a tremendous book. People much more intelligent than I have said much more eloquent things, but it's just an incredible, not only an incredible narrative, but also an incredible book featuring such a well-developed sense of place, of character, of community, and just the language in it and the descriptions of the landscape alone are completely brilliant. So I'm very excited to hear not only your reading, but also more about the book itself. Now, I will quickly read the bios for tonight's presenters and then turn things over to the people you actually want to listen to. So your host for the evening, Rosanna Deerchild, is Cree from the community of Opipon, of which I apologize for my clumsy settler tongue, Cree Nation. She has been a storyteller for more than 20 years. As a journalist, broadcaster, and a poet. She is the host of CBC Radio 1's Unreserved. Her debut poetry collection, The Incredible This Is a Small Northern Town, shared her reflections of growing up in a racially divided place, and it deservedly won the 2009 Aquabooks Lansdowne Prize for Poetry. Her second book, Calling Down the Sky, is a collaborative work with her mother, who was forced to attend Indian residential school. Her first play with Royal MTC's Pimoteoans Creator Circle was called The Secret to Good Tea and was produced for the stage during their 2022-23 season. Our special guest this evening, Waubgeshig Rice, is an author and journalist originally from Waubgeshig First Nation. His first story collection, Midnight Sweat Lodge, which is an incredible book as well, won an Independent Publishers Book Award in 2012. His last novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, was released in October 2018 and became a national bestseller. Reporting for the CBC News for the bulk of his career, in 2014, he received the Anishinaabe Nation's Debawewin Citation for Excellence in First Nation Storytelling, and from 2018 to 2020, he hosted Up North, CBC Radio's afternoon show for Northern Ontario. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Waubgeshig Rice.
Bonjour, Waubgeshig Rice, Makwando Dem, Wasa Sigdon Jaba, Anishinaabe Minwa Jagna Shindak. Good evening, everybody. It's a huge delight to be back here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, a place I called home for 4 years, and it's awesome to see so many familiar faces here. I must not have burned too many bridges when I left, so thanks for coming back. It's just a real honor to be here, to be hosted by McNally Robinson and the Thin Air Writers Festival, and just to be amongst friends and community members here. Winnipeg has always held a special place in my heart, and it's just super awesome to be able to bring my latest story to y'all. So I'll get into the reading right away because my friend will likely skewer me over the next hour or so. She already did last week in Toronto, and it was a lot of fun, so it's going to be fun to do it again. But I'll read a quick passage from Moon of the Turning Leaves. If you're not familiar with Moon of the Crested Snow, it's a story about a Northern Ontario Anishinaabe community that endures a world-changing blackout. And in the aftermath of that, they encounter some unexpected visitors who arrive from the city to the south, and then they're forced to make some tough choices. But ultimately, they're able to find a sense of renewal and regeneration after the end of the world as we know it now. Moon of the Turning Leaves takes place about 10 years after the end of Moon of the Crested Snow, and we find the same community in a new settlement that they've created in the bush off from their old res site. And at this point in their history, they are finding resources around them starting to dwindle, and they recognize that as an Anishinaabe, they were traditionally migratory, so they decide that it's time to move to allow the land to replenish itself and to seek out another place to be, but also to seek out the world to the south, because after some failed attempts to see what happened after the blackout, they haven't really pieced that all together. And they also recognize that their traditional homeland is on the north shore of Lake Huron, and they want to see about reconnecting with that. So in the first book, Evan Whitesky and his partner Nicole McLeod are the main characters, and their children are named Mayangan and Nungos. They're just little kids in the first book. And in the second book, since it's 10 years later, they're teenagers. And I'll read a passage to you. The book begins with a prologue, and I won't read that, but I'll read the chapter 1, which follows right after. And this is essentially a reintroduction to the character of Nungos now that she's a teenager. So here goes. 2 days had passed since Waubgeshig was born, and Nungos had proudly taken on the responsibility of harvesting food for the feast to celebrate her niece's arrival. On short notice, she decided that netting fish in the lake was the best option for a quick return. But it had only been a couple of weeks since the last netting, and she worried the lake's stock was running low. A lot of the fish caught so far this season had seemed undergrown, and she'd heard similar complaints from other fishers. The 10 13-footer she rode out and rocked as she hauled in the net, but she kept her hips loose to prevent it from tipping. Since the age of 5, Nungos had practically lived on this lake, splashing along the shore with her brother, Mayangan, and other kids, rowing out to other inlets to explore, and walking along the ice and cutting holes to fish in the winter. The lake lay just steps from their new settlement, which they called Shkitinakiwen, or New Village. It was wide and deep and teeming with fish when they first arrived, and her people called it simply Zagagan, the word for lake in their language. From the middle, rocky and sandy shores were visible in every direction, illuminated by the sun, which had cleared the tree line in the east. Nungos looked north, back at the settlement, when she and her family had made this land their new home, a half-day's walk from the crumbling homes and buildings of the old reserve. They had laid out their new community in a loose circle. The open space in the middle was kept clear for ceremonies, celebrations, and the play of children. Over the water, Nungos could hear the chatter of little ones in the distance as the community awoke just beyond the shore. The lodges lining that central space were inhabited by the 5 extended families who first came to Shkitinakiwen, led by Nungos' father, Evan Whitesky. She could see her own family's pair of domed dwellings, made of a frame of tied saplings and covered in canvas and plastic tarps, lying closest to the shore, on the outskirts of a permanent camp of 10 more wooden lodges ranged around the central gathering hub. The ceremonial lodge was the largest structure, standing about a meter taller than the other buildings and easily within Nungos' line of sight from her vantage out on the lake. Like most other buildings in this community, it was shaped into a dome, stretched out on the ground like an elongated oval. Walter, the eldest survivor, had instructed Evan and the other younger adults to build it this way, in the manner of the old medicine lodges of the Anishinaabe. To Nungos, Shkitinakiwen was physical evidence that separated the time before, what they called the Jibwa, from the world she knew now, and that made up most of her memories. When her parents and their people were building this village, they erected an extra 2 dwellings on the periphery, in case any holdouts hoping for the lights to come back on at the old reserve, named Gawandagong for the abundant white spruce trees there, would eventually turn up, needing shelter. Like her Uncle Chuck, her mother's cousin, who at first refused to live in the bush, and Dave, the elder Walter's nephew, who remained in the community garage at the old site for as long as he could, half believing the machinery there, the power transformers and trucks, would one day work again. Nungos remembered those two, among a handful of others, trudging through the snow, cheeks gaunt, eyes bloodshot, to join them after most of the holdouts had died off. The final few floats that buoyed the net thudded against the gunwale as Nungos brought in the last of it. 5 more fish, all notably smaller than usual at this point in the season. There were 13 altogether in the heavy green bin. A few twitched in their final nervous throes of life, but most had died shortly after being caught in the white weaves of the net, unable to move and push water through their gills. Nungos sighed and looked back to the shore. Adults were beginning to bustle in the central glade and along the shore, some collecting firewood, others hauling water in buckets. Most of the plastic tarps and canvas coverings of the dwellings were being readjusted or removed in preparation for the coming summer heat. Seeing people out now for daily tasks turned her attention back to the head count for tonight's feast. After everyone ate, the rest of this morning's catch would likely last her family a week at most. A loon flapped its wings low to the water as it passed through her line of sight. She grabbed the handles of the long, light aluminum oars, the oarlocks creaking and rattling as she settled into place to row homeward. As she pumped her right hand to slice the oar's blade through the water and point the bow to the shore, the outlines of the muscles in her arms stretched and constricted in a steady tempo as she paddled herself smoothly to land. The bow came to a stop on the muddy shore, scraping loudly as the hull dug into the rocks below. With the boat firmly planted among the lush green reeds of the shoreline, Nungo stood, turned, and climbed up onto the seat in front of her and made her way to the front. The metal benches had captured the heat of the morning sun and warmed the bare soles of her feet. She leaped over the side and splashed into the shallow, cold water, which came up to her calves. The summer solstice was approaching, but the lake would remain fairly chilly until this peak of the summer heat. Nungos walked around to the bow and began to tug the boat out of the water and up onto the shore. "Need help?" A familiar voice murmured from behind. She turned to see her father walking down the grassy slope to the shore. Evan Whitesky's hair was freshly tied into a braid, and the sun reflected off the sheen of his black crown. He raised his hand to shield his eyes from the glare coming off the water. "Kawin," replied Nungos. "It's not that heavy this morning, sorry to say." She pulled the boat up into the grass and let it sit. Evan came to her side and they peered down into the bin of fish, shoulder to shoulder. "If I caught those with a hook, I would have thrown them back," said Nungos. "But they got caught in the net, so most of them were already dead." "We'll make use of them," Evan said reassuringly. "Might be time to find better fishing spots," she suggested after a short pause. "Let's just clean these for now," her father replied, pulling the bin of fish out of the tin boat and turning to walk back up the slope. Nungos followed, carrying the other empty bin and the tattered nylon net. They ambled up from the shore and onto a plateau where their family's 2 domed lodges stood, each entrance facing a large central fire pit. The larger structure to the west was draped in green canvas tarps, faded by sunlight, but mostly intact. A slightly smaller lodge was covered in a shiny, crinkled blue plastic tarp that rustled with any movement. The greenhouse stood tall enough for full-grown adults to walk around in upright inside, with sufficient headspace. The blue dwelling stood lower, primarily a sleeping space, and a separate home for Nungos' brother Maingan and his partner Pitche, and now their newborn, Wawaskone. Evan carefully placed the haul of fish on the grass in front of the fire pit. Nungos tossed the big plastic bin and white net aside as they each took a seat on one of the stools arranged around the pit. The morning sun climbed higher and the soft humidity from the lake began to beat on their sun-darkened foreheads and bare shoulders. "Apishin gashe?" Nungos asked, not seeing her mother around. "She went out to the garden earlier to get some stuff to cook with these gigonyak. Then I think she was gonna go see her aunties for a little visit," Evan said. "I think a bunch of them are gonna come by. They all wanna see her little shimmis." "Where's the rest of them then?" asked Nungos. "Inside sleeping still pretty tired from it all." She wanted to see the baby girl again, but she didn't want to disturb the new parents. They sat in the comfortable late spring stillness. The sun climbed higher, accentuating their arid surroundings after several days without rain. The flies would descend upon them soon to feast on bare arms and legs, and they could only cover them up with long sleeves and pants or swat them away until the wood smoke from the evening fires provided a shield. Evan set to cleaning the fish and Nungos to mending the net, which they both agreed could use some work. She grabbed a handful of the fine mesh from the bin and pulled it up to eye level. The nylon threads keeping the net together were still strong enough to trap with, But scanning it up and down, she noticed some dire holes. It was their last net of this kind. High tides won't work for a net, Evan reminded her. They'll just soak and get loose and fall off. Maybe some spruce roots would work. Within her short lifetime, they would have been able to buy new nets hewn from thin but sturdy nylon strands from the people in the towns and cities to the south. Food and tools would come to them by air. In the winter, provisions came up on trucks that rolled along the ice. But her father rarely indulged her questions about things like airplanes, trucks, and satellites, and Nungos had mostly given up asking. The words and markings on their older tools and clothing, the things they hadn't made themselves, had become increasingly intangible to her. Now it seemed that almost everything that had come from Jiaonon, from the south, that other world down there, was fading away and falling apart. She had been 3 when the power went out, and only 5 when her father had led their people off the old res and into the bush. But Nungos held on to fading memories of bright lights and soft furniture and rumbling cars and trucks that once took them from place to place. Miigwech, thank you.
Well, that was pretty awesome. Thanks, Wob.
Thanks, Rosanna. Miigwech.
We're matchy polka dots.
We are, yeah.
It's almost like we planned it.
Exactly. You started a new CBC radio show, Polka Dots and Pinstripes.
I
Maybe you're finding? I don't know.
Let's get on that proposal. Who here has read the book? Anybody? Okay. Oh, good. So that was way more than in Toronto.
Yeah.
These guys don't reach. What we got to do here in Winnipeg, though. So welcome back to Winnipeg. We're so glad you could come and visit. Hey, like this is home.
Oh, anyway, thank you.
Your second home, third home-ish.
Yeah.
Man about town. So I have questions, but I also want to invite all of you to stick your hand up when you have a question. It's not going to be like, I will ask these many questions and then you will ask. Just, whenever you feel like you want to jump in. We're just going to keep it casual. I won't skewer you. No skewering will happen today. Maybe just a poke, but that's all. Moon of the Turning Leaves. Loved it. Cried. Wanted to curse your name at certain points. But why did you want to revisit this story, this community, and these people?
Mostly because the readers of the first book wanted me to. I, had not plans on ever writing a sequel to the first one, but when, it got out there and I started meeting people who had read it, the response was generally pretty good, and people started asking me about a sequel. And, in those early days, I said no, because I was just being honest. But then I'd see people get really bummed out because that wasn't the answer they wanted to hear.
Making cuckoos cry.
Yeah. So after a while, I'd say, oh yeah, maybe I'm thinking about it. And I wasn't really, I was just saying that, but after so many times of saying that, I convinced myself that, oh yeah, maybe I am working on a sequel. So I planted the idea in the back of my head and didn't really, work with it that much. But about a year after the book came out, my agent said, if you have a good enough idea, I might be able to find you a home. And that's when I started thinking about it more seriously.
And so what was the final push for you to want to go back and see Evan and his family and the community?
That's a good question. I think it was really the prospect of being able to potentially sign a contract and potentially make money. But and also jump off the mothership, as we know, CBC.
It's a long way down.
So I think I'm still falling.
I've been falling for a year.
Yeah, basically. No, I was really fortunate. All those things sort of came together at the right time. And then the pandemic happened, which was super weird, about a week after I signed the contract and put in my notice at CBC. So yeah, getting back to what I said earlier, was the encouragement of readers. It was really people who were passionate about the characters and wanted to see them more. I felt like I owed that not only to the readers, but to the characters themselves. These were people that, although fictional, lived in my head for a really long time, and I felt related to, and I loved them and cared for them, right? So thinking about it that way was really, inspiring and motivating for me, and that's really how it got going.
It is interesting timing that you started to really start planning and writing this book during the pandemic. Did that fuel the story at all?
Yeah, in some ways, and it changed it too in others, you know. So I left CBC in May of 2020, and that's when I started working on this, you know, more seriously. And by that time, it was like 2 months in, and we all remember that, or we choose to forget it. It wasn't a fun time at all. It was really intense, right? There was no like real inkling of what kind of vaccine would be available, and we're all locking down and nothing was open, and you know, our lives are changing. So that was like scary and frustrating, but I was really fortunate. Our family was really fortunate that our second son was born in June of 2020. So that was a big motivating factor too.
Kind of like diapers.
Yeah, that too. But also it's like, okay, I'm reimagining the future as the world is changing right now. And I have to at least, you know, provide my new son, my baby boy, some hope. You know, I have to carry myself in that way. So I think just in general that helped push me along. But when my editor Rick Meyer and I were planning and developing the story, it was kind of like an audition process. It was kind of weird because I didn't have a first draft before I signed the contract. I basically had to pitch them an idea, right?
Yeah.
So then he and I would have these monthly conversations about, you know, what the story would look like, what would happen, who would be at the center of it, what the settings were like, and so on. And then finally, when he was satisfied that there was enough for a novel there, you know, that's when they offered me the contract. But when we were talking about it, I always said, like, in the first book, you don't find out what the cause of the blackout is, right? And that was intentional, just for the sake of intrigue and
drove me insane.
It was like a secret I kept to myself. I didn't even tell my wife what the cause of it was, right? So yeah, it's like my own deepest, darkest secret, I guess, you know, the cause of this mysterious blackout. But when we were, you know, dreaming up the second one, I was like, well, I got to reveal something or else people are going to be pretty pissed off at me if they read a whole other story and they don't find out what happened, right? So you'll see, if you haven't read it, you'll see like what caused the blackout and then the subsequent events, you know, the collapse. And one part of that collapse was going to be a plague, like that was going to be a major element of it. But as the real plague was happening, Rick and I were like, yeah, maybe we should water that part down. So that's how that changed it. Yeah, pull it back.
And so we know that there is a journey in this book that they decide that they need to move on to greener pastures.
Yeah.
Who goes and why did you choose them?
So, you know, Evan comes back as the main character. Sorry if that's a spoiler. Some people think he's dead at the end of the first one, but he's back in the second one. So he's again, you know, one of the central figures in the story. And because I placed it 10 years in the future, I really wanted the next generation to be at the center of the story. So the two little kids, Mayan and Nungos, are in the first book, and they're teenagers in the second one, right? As I mentioned earlier. So, you know, I thought of some other characters who would go, like a group of about 5 or 6 is what I originally thought. And I thought one of Evan's kids should go with them too. So I think like the first thought, you know, the first trope that would come to mind is like the son. You know, father, son, buddy, adventure kind of thing, right? And when I thought of it that way, I was like, man, that's boring. I do not want to do that. And I'm the dad to 3 boys, right? So I made Mayan be a dad, you know, early in the story so that he has to stay home with his baby. And it just made the most sense to make Nungos go with them, right? Because she's become, you know, a young leader in her own right. She's an expert hunter. She's got superior bush skills compared to all the other kids her age. And also that, you know, like being a dad to 3 boys, it was my responsibility to provide them like a strong female lead character, right, for them to see. So, you know, it was obviously hugely challenging writing about from a teenage girl's perspective, but I thought it was really important to the overall story. And, you know, like there are some hints in the first book of, you know, about resistance to the patriarchal systems that have plagued us as Indigenous people. And I think putting her at the center further smashes that patriarchy in some ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. of course, you have it so that we're very just centered on this group. You know, the first book was just the community. We didn't know what was happening outside. It was felt very real in that regard. Why do you think Anishinaabe people or Indigenous people in general would survive an apocalypse?
I think, you know, there are some traditions we have. Many of our communities are still, you know, based in our homelands, albeit in much smaller pockets than originally we had. And, you know, it goes back to what inspired the first book for me, which was this big blackout that happened 20 years ago, actually, in August of 2003. You know, like Toronto, Ottawa, like Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, you know, we're all in the dark on this one summer afternoon. I was living in Toronto at the time, but I was home in Wisconsin. I was sitting for my dad and stepmom with my two younger brothers. And the power went out there, and we didn't think much of it because, like, the power, you know, always goes out here and there. It's the res, yeah. But it was like a sunny day, and we were like, okay, weird, whatever. So the afternoon went on, and we decided we were bored, so we decided to drive into town, into Parry Sound, which is only about a 10-minute drive away. And we saw that the power was out there too. You know, like all the traffic lights were out, the stores were closed. And we're like, holy geez, must be serious if the power's out in town too. Like, that's the canary in the coal mine right there, you know? So we got kind of freaked out, and we saw some friends of ours who were on the main street in town, and we stopped and talked to them, and they heard on the radio that it was this massive blackout. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody knew when it was going to be resolved. And we got even more scared. And we went right back to the res and like made a survival plan. My two younger brothers and I, you know, we like counted all the cans of food in the cupboard, and we like gathered firewood because like the electric oven in the kitchen was useless, all this stuff, right? But as the day went on, we're like, okay, what are we gonna do tomorrow? You know, let's go check back in on our grandma. Let's go see our uncle over here. He might have some live bait or some fishing lures we can use. Or let's go see our auntie over here. She might have some medicine if we get sick, you know, like bush medicine. And the more we thought about it, we're like, oh, you know, this is the best place to be in a moment like this. You know, we're way better off here than we would be in the city, you know. And we're really comforted, like we weren't scared anymore. And so the next morning we got up to go fishing, because we're like, well, fish is on the menu forever now, so let's go fishing. But right before we left, the power came back on, and we turned on the TV and, you know, saw everything that happened. Then an hour later, we're playing video games again, and just like totally forgot about our survival thing, right? But that's where that started. You know,
who wrote this list?
Exactly. What? Drink toilet water. So yeah, that's where it started. But yeah, I felt like, okay, this is the ultimate place to be, and that idea really stuck with me for a long time, and that's eventually how Moon of the Crescent Stone started.
Questions? Anyone?
I want to say I was in Toronto when that happened. I was in Toronto when the power went out.
Oh yeah.
So you were in the bush, and I was in the city, and yeah. So we. It was terrifying. It was dark. Yeah. There were no lights at all. I don't know anybody else here in Toronto 20 years ago. And one of the things, though, that was interesting is the stores couldn't freeze their food anymore. So they pulled it all out, and they started cooking for everyone. And you just walked down the street, and there was food and community. It was the most bizarre experience. Because it was like, food's gonna go bad anyhow. We might as well cook it. We might as well give it away, and that was. And then people took other people in because all of the cars and transit systems were down. So I had people at my house who couldn't get home, and it just changed. Yeah, everything. So I can see how that inspired you, right? Yeah. Well, the other thing too is I went back to Toronto a few days later because I had to work, and I went to my apartment where I lived with a couple of my buddies, and I was like, "Oh, what was it like here?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, it was wild. You know, it was pretty neat." And I said, "Well, what did you guys do?" And they're like, "Well, we just, you know, drank all the beer before it got too warm." And I was like, "Didn't you guys think about, you know, how you're going to eat or anything like that?" Click? Exactly. Yeah. Did you guys? Oh, I'm gonna bore that one for you for the next one. So anyway, yeah. But keep in mind, we're all like in our early 20s at the time, right? So, but yeah. So I was like, okay, I'm definitely not staying here. Next time something like this happens, hitting the road back. You're not on my apocalypse. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you did really as you said, the cause of the blackout was not in the first book. Your wife didn't know. It's a wonder you were actually able to have more children, because I would have kicked your ass out of bed.
Well, I would say, like, you know, whenever the royalty checks come in, I'll pay for a nail appointment. So that's like, and that's how I dealt with that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But in this book, you do, they do eventually find out what had happened, and you chose a rather beautiful ending, as endings go. I mean, it was a good view. But also the descent, the collapse of society was quite fast. It was quick, and you see that evidence as they journey along. What kind of research did you do to ensure the authenticity of that journey?
A lot, yeah. Like when you get to the cause, you'll see it's a very scientific thing, right? So I had to like, because with the first book, I was like, okay, this is what caused it. And I was like, I don't have to look anything up because I'm not writing this ever again, right? I'm in the clear. So then it's like right part 2, oh shit, I have to figure out what I'm talking about, right? So yeah, so I researched that, how that works, the impact of it. And I'm being very vague because some of you have to get there, but like how it impacts, you know, the electrical grid and things like that. But that's just one thing that causes this collapse, right? And like when you read it, it may seem like a dog's breakfast of cataclysms that cause the end of the world. And you know, some people might think, you know, how realistic is that? But, you know, we saw over the course of the pandemic and through other events that
some of y'all still got toilet paper in your
exactly. Yeah. But like things, you know, there's a domino effect of these major cataclysms, right? And it wouldn't be too far beyond the scope of possibility that everything would just fall apart after all these things happen, right? So yeah, it was like some scientific research. There are some bad guys in the book. You know, that won't give it away. You can just imagine they'll encounter bad guys. I did a lot of YouTube research for those guys and like freaked myself out like big time.
Let's just say they all could be wearing certain red hats.
That's not far off. You're right. Yeah. So yeah, I went down all these YouTube rabbit holes and just like scared myself. And I don't recommend doing that. But yeah, I had to figure out like how do some people actually see the end of the world? You know, who are not like me. And people have different views of how the world's going to end and what they're going to have to do to survive, right? So it's freaky.
Yeah. I do actually want to unpack that just a little bit without any spoilers. The disciples are the group that they encounter, and they're right-wing, militaristic. They want to rule the world with violence. Why did you choose such a dichotomous opposition? Was it just a storytelling thing, or was it a message that you were trying to convey there?
I guess it was a bit of both. First and foremost, like I'm scared of dudes like that. Like I'll fully admit it. Like that is freaky to know that there are people out there who are stockpiling ammo and, you know, have a lot of guns in their basement and are, you know, preparing for the end of the world with all of this gear. You know, like that's freaky, man. And you know, as we saw in the first book, like I have a different view of the end of the world and what's possible from there. So yeah, it is kind of like polar opposites, but I don't necessarily see it as like a story of good versus evil, because I think that was what the first book was mostly about. The first book is about like this moment of collapse and the immediate aftermath and the struggle between good and evil. But when you go that much farther into the future, and like you see this in stories like The Last of Us or Station 11, the lines of morals are blurred much more, right? Like people are morally ambiguous when survival is ultimately at stake. And I think you see that emerge in this book too, even with Evan. Like he's traumatized not just by the blackout, but by, you know, living as an Indigenous man in Canada. And you know, as things go on and as they're faced with another challenge, he starts making some uncharacteristic decisions too, I think, right? Yeah. So with the disciples, you know, and I won't get too much away about them, but there's another character that emerges from that group too that I think, you know, fully represents that moral ambiguity in some ways. And yeah, like I felt like it was important to explore that through that character especially.
Questions? Do we have questions? Oh, we got 2, 3. Oh, wow, we're getting here. We're getting some.
We're just wondering, the jumping off the Starship CBC You've got a spouse and children at home. At what point do you tell yourself, I can do this and I don't need to worry about income and financial security for food and stuff?
Well, it took a lot of planning for sure. You know, it was about 6 months in the making, I would say. In the fall of 2019, when it looked like a sequel would be a possibility, when, you know, I might get offered a contract, my wife and I started talking about that. And we're like, well, just signing this contract is not going to sustain us. It's going to be, you know, a decent amount of money, but not enough. What else can I do to you know, feed our kids? And we had another one coming at that point too, right? And we've since had another one, so busy pandemic times for us. Right?
He was not counting cleansing.
So yeah, you know, and my wife is just hugely supportive. You know, she, you know, when we first got together, I was writing. It was like a, you know, a creative outlet on the side for me. But we always talked about maybe the possibility of one day being able to do it full time. So yeah, it was a lot of planning. But still, you know, you're giving up like the job security, benefits, and all that. So there's other arrangements you have to make around that too. But sign up for my webinar, you know, and then I'll show you how.
For the low price. $10,000.
I think Cecil had a question in the back there.
Cecil.
I will.
Hi, Cecil.
Welcome back to Manitoba, where having the first name Wob is popular.
That's a good month to be called Wob, I guess.
I want to ask you what the difference is. Like, talk about journalism versus writing fiction, and how, I don't know, how did you adapt to that? How different is it? I mean, in journalism, you're talking to people all the time, and in writing, you're sitting alone.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, well, first, I acknowledge you for starting my CBC career. Cecil hired me, you know, 17 years ago to work at CBC. Yeah, very grateful for that. Thank you, Cecil. Yeah. You know, I find they fuel each other in many ways. You know, when you're a journalist, in whatever capacity, as a chase producer or as a host or as a VJ, you know, you have the privilege of talking to different people every day and learning about their real life experiences. And they entrust you with those stories, right? You know, that they trust you to put it out to the wider public in a proper way, essentially. So that was always like a great honor for me. I always consider that a big responsibility and a privilege. And when you're doing like a daily news story, you're interviewing like, you know, 2 or 3 people a day and talking to many more who don't make it into your story or on camera or whatever. So when I was about to leave CBC, I calculated, and I'd done something like 10,000 interviews over the course of my career, you know, just in that time. And when you have that, you know, front row seat to humanity, it can only benefit you as a storyteller, no matter how you try to tell stories, right? So I always say that, like, I'm able to dream up real character or fictional characters thanks to all the real people that I've known over the course of my life, but especially over the course of my journalism career. And I was talking to Janet about this today on the show, but like one of the major highlights for me was covering the apology here in June of 2008, the residential school apology by Stephen Harper. And that was when, you know, I saw like a lot of people really being empowered to share their stories of surviving residential school. And I was just, you know, so in awe of their bravery and their candor in doing that, you know. So, you know, when you're able to witness that kind of thing, it's just the most special thing, and it's very, very powerful. So yeah, I am inspired by that. And that's not to say that I would ever, you know, use those real people's experiences or stories in anything that I write fictionally, but like I'll remember how they may have responded to something, or maybe their inflection as they said a certain thing, and you know, I would hear that in my head and try to write that out for another character or something like that, you know. So yeah, I think my fiction career has greatly benefited from my journalism career. And at the same time, you know, like, I loved my time at CBC, and I felt very fortunate, as I said, to be able to do it, because at CBC you have different platforms that you can tell stories on, right? Like web, radio, TV, etc. And you're able to contextualize a lot of things that a lot of other media outlets can't. And I really appreciate it and enjoy that too. But at the same time, you're still confined to time and space when you're working in different media formats, right? And, you know, there are really quick decisions you have to make that you know, maybe won't benefit the story that you're trying to do. There are things you have to leave out, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. But in fiction, you can make all the choices you want, you know, rooted in truth and reality, and really convey a particular message and tailor it to readers in that way too. So I feel like right now, you know, I can get to a truth on my own terms through fiction.
10,000 interviews.
Something like that, yeah.
Wow.
But you've probably done more than that. Yeah. You've been at it longer than me. So
Thanks, someone. I guess. So one time I was doing streeters for the show, and it was a Valentine's Day special, and he had hickeys on his neck. I don't know what it is. These guys. So I said, "Why do you have hickeys?" And he said, "Because it lets other girls know you're token." I just love that.
Nice.
Any more questions?
Yeah, sure. So I still have questions about this world you created, like what happens when their metal tools and their plastic tools start falling apart? Are they able to reconstruct the pre-colonialism knowledge? Or what happened in Europe and Asia and Africa, and why did aid never come? Like, was there dog's breakfast everywhere in the world? So will there be a third?
I see where you're going with that. Yeah, there's stuff I researched that didn't make it in, like, you know, how long a whetstone lasts to sharpen tools, you know. I did consider what happened elsewhere, but I did wanted to keep it confined to like Turtle Island, just because that was a lot more immediate. And I sort of imagine similar things happening elsewhere, which is why like you don't see anything else happen. Very much in the same vein as like Station 11, you know, like, but in that story, everybody knows what happened, right? But yeah, to answer your question, you know, I won't rule out a third part, but I'm not going to do it anytime soon. You know, like I've been living in this end of the world sort of mindset for about 10 years now, and I kind of want to try something else. But yeah, you know, I ruled out a sequel the first time, and here we are talking about it, you know, so.
Just gonna peer pressure and that's.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a question there in the back over here. Oh.
Okay, sorry, I'll be quick. Hi, Bob.
Hey, Harriet.
Hi. So The Marrow Thieves is a book that comes to mind, and it was so dystopian. It was so disturbing. I mean, it's I don't know, do you want to comment on it, like the fact that your both books are in the bush, like out away from so-called civilization and all that, and the opportunity that affords you to construct a story. I couldn't read the sequel to The Marrow Thieves because I found that one so disturbing. It was great, and I liked the way you did it too. Like you have when people intrude on the community, the disruption, how it just shakes everything. You know, that fellow shook everything. And so I just like you to comment on that, on this sort of almost perfection that the wilderness offers, but the danger and all that. And I don't know, do you have any, how did you perceive that when you were doing it?
Yeah, well, to talk about Cherie first, she and I were at the BAM Center in the fall of 2015 at the same time. And we're both like, oh, what are you working on? What are you working on? And we both said, oh, like a post-apocalyptic story about Indigenous people. And we're both like, oh, shit. But yeah, Marrow Thieves came out first, and obviously it's been a global phenomenon, deservedly so, right? But it's also cool to see like both stories are so different, you know, and they both live and breathe in their own ways. With the landscape in particular, the point of both books is really to reimagine your relationship with the land around you, you know, and to think about how basically every society, every civilization around the world comes from like an agrarian background, you know, of gathering food from the bush and harvesting and so on, right? And we've really only been in this like industrial or technological era for like 200, 300 years or so, which is like the blink of an eye over the course of human civilization, right? But we've been detached by technology, by industry, by these luxuries, myself included, of course. If this happened, I'd be shit out of luck big time, you know? So I wouldn't fare that well myself. But yeah, like, with the second book in particular, I really wanted like the land itself not just to be a setting, but to be a force that drives them and drives the plot. And it's something that they rediscover, many of them, as they go on this quest to the south. And they remember the respect that they have for it, right? And they learn to love and care for it and exist with it rather than as a product of it in some ways. And that's just like a fundamental Anishinaabe belief, I think, that you know, spans a lot of Indigenous cultures. And as I mentioned, cultures around the world, no matter who you are. But one last thing I wanted to mention about like the whole dystopian idea. You know, like both of these books are classified as post-apocalyptic or dystopian, and you know, I accept that. You know, they have to go on the shelf somewhere, right? They have to be marketed somehow too. But I don't see them that way. Like I see them more as like post-urban or post-industrial or post-state stories. You know, they're about, you know, renewal after all that stuff is gone, and regeneration essentially. And the Cherokee scholar and author Daniel Heath Justice has a really cool term that he uses for speculative fiction by Indigenous and Black authors. He doesn't like using the term speculative fiction, I think, because like to me, it's kind of scientific, you know, it's like you're proving a hypothesis or something when you're speculating about the future. So he calls it wonder works instead. You know, you're wondering about the future, you know, wondering about the beautiful things you can bring from your past into the future once you're liberated by this collapse, right, of the state and society. And I think that's a really cool way to look at it. And that's what I try to do with both of these books.
Have you any advice for any aspiring novelists or authors in general?
Yeah, you know, my basic advice is just to write out your story. Get as much of it down, because that is the biggest first step, I think. You know, any agent or publisher is going to want to see a full first draft first. I was really lucky with this one that, you know, I was essentially commissioned to do it, but you know, I had to pitch it over the course of several months, right? But yeah, I would say write out your draft, you know, take another good look at it before you send it anywhere. But that is really I think the essence of being a writer is just making sure that you have something fully written down and fully formed and presentable too.
Jessica is watching online and was wondering, I've been listening to the audiobook versions and they are fabulous. How did you decide who would narrate the audiobooks, or did you play a role in that?
Yeah, well, when the first one was coming together, the publisher, ECW Press, said, you know, we're doing the audiobook. We have a list of people who we want to narrate it. And Billy Morasti was on the list. And I was familiar with Billy's
fabulousness.
Yeah, his fabulousness since I was young. You know, I watched him on TV, watched him on stage, and just always loved him. And I said, yeah, I definitely want Billy, you know, and he was up for it. And when he did it, it was pretty cool because, like, you know, he's from Northern Manitoba, he's Cree, you know, and when he would want to get the pronunciation for the Anishinaabe words, he would text me and he's like, hey bro, how do you pronounce this? And I would just like record it into my phone and then send it back to him while he was in the booth, right? Like doing it in real time. So it's pretty cool. And then when the audiobook was, you know, being arranged for the second one, they asked me who I wanted, and of course I wanted him back. So there's a beautiful continuity there, I think, thanks to him. And he just breathes a whole new life into the story that you know, I'm just so blessed to have him on this journey. You know, it's just amazing. Leonard had a question here.
Oh, I also suffer from mysterious blackouts. Very relatable. I'm wondering, as a Anishinaabe, like storyteller, I know, like for myself, I'm a musician, and storytelling is very important. But with the success of shows like Reservation Dogs and stuff like that, do you see this this series being turned into like something that could be put into a film where you could help visual with music and visuals as well? Is that something that you have on the horizon or that you would like to do?
Yeah, I would love to see that. You know, it's not happening yet, but it would be, you know, so cool to see somebody's adaptation of it. You know, to see it imagined for the screen, but also in an entirely collaborative way, as you say, like having you do the music, at some point would be pretty deadly. But yeah, like Reservation Dogs, acting good, like seeing these shows that are entirely Indigenous driven is just like revolutionary in my opinion. And it's providing like a real sense of belonging for a lot of Indigenous people to see, finally authentic representation, widely viewed by everybody else on the screen, So yeah, you can't help but be like totally inspired by that. So yeah, I would like to see it someday, but we'll see when that happens. Piece is ready.
The story between Edmund and Nicole is just so beautiful. It's such a lovely, honest story. And I'm wondering what inspired that.
I guess it's probably, the relationship I have with my wife in some ways. Those two characters aren't inspired by the two of us. But yeah, like when the world ends, if you're fortunate to be loved and be in a supportive partnership, that can help you survive essentially. So, over the course of me dreaming up this story, and then the second one, like our family, we started a family and our family grew, and really that showed to me what matters the most in this world is caring for the future, right? With somebody else, if you're fortunate enough to do that, and raising kids to be their best selves autonomously, right? But on your own terms, which is amazing because so many of our ancestors didn't have that. Like even our recent ancestors, like our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. So, we can raise our kids to be proudly Anishinaabe, and my wife and I are from the same region on the North Shore of Lake Huron, descended from the same Anishinaabe. So we are raising our kids in that region now, and it's a really powerful thing. So yeah, I don't like take moments of our lives and write them into the story, but it probably happens naturally, I think. Well, I hope so anyway. If she's watching tonight, this is the
Hi, I'm just curious. I know that you said you've been living in this post-apocalyptic world for 10 years. What's a new world that you want to visit, or where are you going with your writing?
Oh, the next thing I want to write is like a res comedy, like a day in the life of a res. There's a very specific scenario I have in mind. I don't want to give it away because I don't know if it's going to work.
Because I'm going to steal it.
It'll end up on the stage here in Winnipeg before it ends up in a book, right? Yeah. So yeah, I want to do something a little more lighthearted. But what I really enjoyed the most about writing these two books, especially, and the earlier books I wrote, was just trying to be as authentically Anishinaabe as possible, and showing the day-to-day realities that we have and the often beautiful lives we're able to lead, right? Despite everything that has happened in our history, and that's sort of what means the most to me. The feedback that I get is when someone says, oh yeah, I felt like I saw my community there, or that character reminds me of my auntie, or yeah, we do that in our res kind of thing, right? So that's what I'm trying to convey. And like, maybe I couldn't do that as much in journalism as I wanted to, just because of those constraints I mentioned. But like, I can write about how we listen to AC/DC and love it, or how we smudge, specifics of that and those kinds of things. So yeah, so that's what the next book I want to write is gonna have a lot of, I hope, anyways.
It has to have a character that likes to cut off the skin.
Yes.
It's Wobbs.
Yeah, I can't write the Toronto Maple Leafs in there anymore. People can get sick of that. I almost wore a Leaf shirt here tonight, but I was like, oh, I gotta stop.
Get out! Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, or yeah.
Hi, well, I just wanted to say I'm a teacher in an adult literacy program, and we've been reading your books as part of our development. And a lot of the students find it not scary, post-apocalyptic, but very hopeful and very inspirational. The description of how the community supports itself and whatnot. So I just wanted to give that to you, just so you know.
Thank you.
How amazing it is. And inspirational for them to keep reading. So
right on. Yeah. So be blessed. Thank you. Time for one more? Anybody have a question?
Nope, we can close out with this question.
Everybody always has questions at the end. You guys.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in front of this Winnipeg Jets crowd here, how far the Maple Leafs can go.
Oh, come on.
All the way. All
Can
the
you
way.
just kill the mic, please? Just
Watch.
kill it. Just kill it.
Watch for the Stanley Cup parade on University Avenue in June. It's gonna happen.
So I'll turn things over to you folks, and then we'll call Charlene up to say some closing words.
Okay, well, you go ahead.
Oh,
Some closing wisdom for the folks here in Winnipeg.
I'm out of wisdom. I get it all from you. It rubs off from me. Oh, it's just Chimigwech, it's super special to be here. It's really wonderful to share in this moment with you all. I appreciate you all coming out. This is a very special place to me. And just I want to express my love and respect and gratitude to you all. This has just been a really nice night. And Chimigwech, big thanks to Rosanna Deerchild. Big round of applause for her.
Notice I wasn't applauding myself. Kidding, he's like, yay, me.
I don't know.
Wow, some humility, jeez.
This has been just a spectacular conversation. Thank you both, Wab and Rosanna. We're invited into these sort of deep but very playful and funny and insightful conversations about what I think the main term I'm going to take home with me is wonder world. That is such a compelling idea, and it does grab both the curiosity of like wondering about something and also the awe aspect of understanding that you belong to a large and beautiful and complex structure. So thank you for your books. I remember having a great chat with you with the very first book in the green room at MTYP a lot of years ago at the festival, and it's just been a thrill to watch your career develop and emerge. So congratulations. And will you all give a huge round of applause to both Rosanna and Wab. In the presence of a couple of the really major voices in Canadian literature right now. And it's great that all of you are here to witness that.
Oh, Charlene, you're so nice. Gosh, no wonder they keep putting you in charge of this.
Well, I actually say what I mean. So I actually mean that. So thank all of you for coming tonight, because these kind of gatherings are better when there's more, when there's more of us to gather and listen and kind of take away a fullness and that hopefulness that a couple of you commented on. It's good for all of us as we go back into our lives, which are sometimes a little bit scary, and we do feel like we need to make sure we have a click on the shelf in case the power goes out. I would like to just make a moment to be grateful to our hosts here at McNally Robinson. This is a place where we do gather regularly and where we are in the presence of all sorts of voices and stories, some of them in person and some of them on the shelves. So a big thanks to John, who keeps popping back and forth, making things work so smoothly, and to Chris and Angela. You guys just make us all at home here. This is such a core place for us to gather in this community. So a big round of applause for McNally, please. You've been to even bigger cities, over the past month when we had writers here during the festival who've not been in Winnipeg before, me coming here, they're like, what? This place is in Winnipeg? It's like, So every city does not have a place like this. So we are very fortunate here. That's partly an encouragement for you to buy this book. But of course, those of you who haven't read it yet, you definitely want to buy it now because you've had a chance to hear about it and get drawn into it. Thanks to Pinger Random House for making this visit possible. And there's the last bit of business, which is Waubgeshig is going to be safely transported to the sign table.
Security.
This is always kind of a mystery. We don't know kind of what today's version of transport is going to look like. But the signing table is over beside the cash desk, and you can line up and get your book signed and then pay for it. Or you can actually get a book at the cash desk and then get in line. So, just to move the move the people through very efficiently. But the bottom line is you cannot leave the store without paying for the book. They do it like that here, just that's the way they roll. So if you'll just stay put for a moment while we watch this safe transport happen. I think it might be, I don't know.
I don't know, I'm 210 pounds. I don't know who's gonna carry me.
I'm not crowd surf. Anyway, thank you all for coming. One more